Hello everyone, Happy New Year and welcome back to another video. So my reading goal for 2023 was to read 23 books, rather appropriately for the year, and initially when I set this target I thought that this would be a bit of a challenge considering in 2022 I read a grand total of 7 books, not counting the ones I kind of had to read for my degree and didn't particularly enjoy. So 23 books was a bit of a step up, but I still thought it would be somewhat achievable. Well, I can now tell you that my grand total of books that I read in 2023 is 112. That's right, I read my 112th book earlier today, just in time for the new year. So just to put that into perspective, that is just under 5 times my initial goal of 23 books and 16 times the amount of books that I read last year. So safe to say I am rather proud of myself, but also slightly concerned that I apparently didn't have much of a life outside of reading. So I can't really be bothered to go into kind of an in-depth review of every single book that I read this year. A lot of them I can't really remember particularly well, so I thought what would be better would be to pick out my favourite books out of the selection and give a little bit of a summary of each of them and why I enjoyed them so much. So without further ado, these are the top 23 books that I read in 2023. Now before we get into this, I have laid down a few kind of ground rules for this kind of selection of books. So firstly, in terms of like the way I've arranged these books in this video, it's been kind of somewhat a random arrangement. I haven't really put down kind of an order of preference for individual books, but they are still arranged vaguely in terms of like number of stars that I gave it. So the first part of the video will be my 4.5 star rated books, then the second part will be the 4.75 star rated books, and then the final part will be the 5-star books, the like creme de la creme, the best ones that I read this year, like the top tier. But within those kind of star rating categories, I haven't ordered the books in terms of preference. They've been pretty much randomly arranged, or arranged in order that I think fits for the video. I don't know if that makes sense. My second rule is that I have not counted individual books within a series. So basically what that means is if there are multiple books that could have been included in this video and they're all part of the same series, I have kind of included them under one book. They're all kind of one single entry in the list, and that's so that I can include as many different books as I could in this video. And my third rule was that I did not include rereads in this list. I only counted books that I have read for the first time this year, and that only really affected a few books because I'm not someone who tends to reread stuff. But yeah, that was a rule that I imposed. So this time, without further ado, let's get stuck into the list. So in this first portion of the video, I am going to talk about my 4.5 star ratings of the year. So these are books that are objectively really good. I still definitely enjoyed reading them, but they may not have elicited a particularly emotional response from me, or they may have had a couple of flaws to them that didn't necessarily give them a 4.75 star or 5-star rating. But that definitely doesn't mean that they're not good books. In fact, I would recommend any and all of these books to people. They're part of the top 20 or so % of books for a reason. They are very good books. So first up, we are starting with The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, which I read fairly early on this year. And this book really needs no explanation. I feel like everyone and their mother knows what this book is about. It's kind of this made-up version of old Hollywood with original characters, and it's this kind of fictionalized autobiography of this Hollywood starlet who is now in her 80s and has kept very private, and she's only just now coming out with the true story of her life. Now, I will stress that I read a significant portion of this book in accident and emergency while I was waiting to be seen for a concussion, so that may or may not have skewed my opinion on this book somewhat. However, I still maintain that I really enjoyed this book. There was a lot of kind of the world of old Hollywood that was very vivid, and all of the different characters. Yeah, I think that this book is really popular for a reason. Like, it's a good read. And on that note, book number 2 is Carrie Soto is Back, also by Taylor Jenkins Reid. And this is set in the same kind of world as Evelyn Hugo, although it's a few years after kind of her rise to fame. And it's about a tennis star called Carrie Soto who returns from retirement to reclaim her world record and win more kind of Grand Slam titles. And I particularly really enjoyed this book because I am a big tennis fan. I grew up playing tennis. It was kind of the one sport that I considered myself decent at, and I love watching Wimbledon every year. So I felt like I had a good amount of knowledge when it came to reading the bits with the matches and bits about the training and stuff. I don't know if this book has the same impact on people who don't particularly know the ins and outs of tennis, but for me, I really enjoyed that aspect of it, and yeah, I enjoyed the book. Also, I think it's important to note that I read most of this book while sitting in the virtual queue to buy Taylor Swift tickets for her Paris concerts. I did not get those tickets. They paused the queue for hours and then rescheduled it to another day. However, I think it's quite funny how I seem to find myself in interesting situations when I'm reading Taylor Jenkins Reid books. I don't know. It's funny. Hello, it's 2024 Liv here. Spooky. And I was just editing this video, and why am I wearing the same t-shirt as I was in that? I promise you I do my laundry. I just apparently really like wearing this t-shirt. So I was editing this video and I realised that I actually ended up starting Malibu Rising, also by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and in the same universe as Carrie Soto and Evelyn Hugo. I started that book also while I was in the waiting room of Accident and Emergency, this time waiting to be seen for a sprained ankle. So I don't know, that's another weird coincidence and potentially a sign that I am just rather accident prone. So yeah, that was just something else to note, a little bit of fun trivia for you. Anyway, I do need to get back to editing this footage because it does turn out to be a lot. Who would have known, me talking about 23 of my favourite books in a fair amount of detail? So I will hand you back over to 2023 Liv to continue on with this video. Enjoy! Okay, book number 3, we are moving on to an absolute classic, literally. It's The Bell Jar. Again, I feel like this book needs no further explanation. It's kind of mentally ill girls are mentally ill in New York. And I just felt like this book found me at the right time. I'm kind of in a stage in my life where I'm not sure what I want to do with my future, much like the main character of this book. And this kind of aimlessness that the main character has, I think, really kind of got through to me, and I really appreciated a lot of the book. So that was The Bell Jar. It's definitely not for everyone, and it's definitely really dated at points, but I think it's really interesting how there are parts in this book, such as like the fig tree analogy, for example, that resonate with people to this day. Next up, and this is not the only time this author is going to turn up in this video, as you will very well know if you have been on my channel before, this is All's Well by Mona Awad. So this is a story about a high school theatre teacher whose class is kind of out of control. They're kind of revolting against her, and she's got a lot of chronic pain and her life's pretty much falling apart. And then she comes into this kind of supernatural power that allows her to take revenge upon the people who have been tormenting her. I think that anyone who is a theatre girly, and I mean theatre girly in a completely gender neutral sense, will appreciate this book. It's filled with Shakespearean references and dream sequences, and it's all very, very trippy, and it was a lot of fun to read. I really enjoyed it. As I said, this is not the only time Mona Wild's going to appear in this video. I just really enjoy her writing. It's so trippy, it's so kind of vibey. It's writing you just kind of want to wade into and get yourself lost in, even though you don't really have any idea what's happening plot-wise. So that is All's Well by Mona Wild. Next up we have No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood, and this is about a minor internet personality who goes through this really devastating family tragedy. And the first half of the book is spent very much on the internet. It's made up of these very short kind of tweet-like paragraphs that are very kind of snappy, and they don't make a massive load of sense to people who aren't, you know, chronically online and spend a lot of time on social media like I do. And then the second half is focused on this family tragedy, and the kind of lines between online and offline are kind of blurred, and the protagonist kind of realizes that she does spend too much of her life online without really appreciating what life actually is. And it was this second half that really did it for me. It was just so kind of intimately written and so incredibly sad, but a lot of it was kind of implied. It was very much kind of show not tell in a way. So overall I am very glad that I kind of stuck through the weirdness and the bittiness of the first half of the book to get to the real kind of emotional climax of the second half. So that was No One Is Talking About This. We've got another short book now, and this is another author that will appear again in this video. This is Girl Meets Boy by Ali Smith. This is a retelling of the Roman myth of Iphis and Ianthe, and it's set in Inverness in the early 2000s. And it's about this woman who falls in love with a butch lesbian anarchist who graffitis these revolutionary phrases all over Inverness. And this is another instance of me being absolutely blown away by the prose. There's another kind of dream sequence-esque scene in this book, and I've come to realise this year that I absolutely adore well-written dream sequences, so that was definitely part of what got me with this book. I thought the story was really sweet and really impactful and really romantic, even though it's such a short book. Like, I read it within like half a day. So that is Girl Meets Boy by Ali Smith. We are sticking with mythological retellings for the time being, because the next book is For the Winner by Emily Hauser. This is a retelling of the myth of Atalanta and Jason the Argonauts. And what I found really interesting about this book, and what I didn't kind of expect to enjoy as much as I did, was that Emily Hauser ended up kind of changing the kind of canon story a little bit. It's got kind of elements of Mulan in a way, because Atalanta disguises herself as a man to join the Argonauts. And I mean, Mulan's one of my favourite Disney films of all time, so obviously I really enjoyed that. And what I also didn't expect to enjoy as much as I did was the romance subplot in this book. Atalanta and Hippomenes have this kind of enemies slash rivals lovers romance going on throughout this book. As I said, I wasn't really expecting to enjoy it because I was more there for Atalanta's journey as an individual rather than kind of any romance that would threaten to disrupt her kind of arc. But I thought it was really, really well done in this book, and yeah, I thoroughly enjoy it. This was my favourite book in the kind of Golden Apples trilogy that Emily Hauser wrote. And yeah, the trilogy as a whole is really, really good, and I think it's incredibly slept on, and more people need to read it. And this one is overall my favourite. Okay, our next book is All the Lonely People by Mike Gale. This book is kind of a dual timeline story that follows the life of Hubert Bird, who is a Windrush generation immigrant to the UK, and one part of the story follows his life just from arriving in the UK and kind of facing a lot of racism in society and getting married and having children. And then the other part of the book follows him now as an old man, and he has been living as a recluse for several years, and he decides that it is finally time to get back out into the real world and reintegrate himself into society. And I just found this book so emotional. Like, Hubert is such a sweet character. Like, he's really endearing as a protagonist. And the fact that so many awful things happen to him throughout the course of his life, I'm guessing, is that kind of a spoiler? I don't know if that's a spoiler. But basically that made me really emotional. And this book definitely brought me very close to tears. And I'm not someone who tends to cry over books, so this one really did it for me. Next up we have Minor Detail by Adania Shibley, and this is a very short book. I read it for the Reading is Resistance readathon earlier this year, and it's split into two parts. The first part is about a group of Israeli soldiers who capture and torture and kill this young Palestinian woman in 1948, and then the second part of this book is about a modern day young woman who discovers this story of the Palestinian woman in 1948 and decides to try and investigate further. And this book was written a couple of years ago, but I think it is even more poignant reading it right now. Like, it was genuinely very well written, all of the kind of recurring themes in both halves of the book, and it was just very haunting. Like, the way that this modern Palestinian woman talks about some of the things that she has to go through while living under the Israeli occupation. She talks about them very kind of bluntly and very casually, just like it's, you know, it's something that she has to do every day. It's completely normal, when as someone who doesn't have to do stuff like that every day, it's quite jarring to read. It was just very haunting and very sad, and yeah. Next up we have If on a Winter's Night a Traveller by Italo Calvino, and this is kind of a book within a book within a book within a book. Basically, it's about this reader. It's told in second person, so it uses kind of you pronouns for the reader, and this reader is reading a book, except this book has a error in the publication. So the reader goes back to the bookshop, tries to get it exchanged for a different book, except that book also gets interrupted, and this reader kind of goes on this whole adventure to try and discover kind of the origin of this publication error and find this original book that he wanted to read in the first place. And interspersed throughout that story, there are also a bunch of kind of first chapters of a load of different books, of a load of different genres. I genuinely have never read anything like this before, and I don't think I will ever read anything like this in the future. Like, it's just a completely unique book. It's very meta, it's very self-aware. It's just such an interesting concept, and it was executed really well as well. And yeah, I would definitely recommend it to people as just something to read that will stick with you. That was If on a Winter's Night a Traveller. Next up we have Yellowface by Rebecca Kwong. This is another book that I feel needs no explanation because it has literally been everywhere. It's about a white author who steals this manuscript of her friend, a fellow author who dies, who happens to be Asian, and passes this manuscript off as her own and becomes this kind of overnight success, and then has to deal with kind of the fallout of plagiarizing someone else's work. And I just feel like this is a bit of a masterclass in creating a deliberately unlikable protagonist. I love protagonists that are deliberately unlikable, and I specify deliberately because there are occasions when I have read books where protagonists are unlikable, but it's not the intent of the author for them to be unlikable. They're just kind of annoying. Whereas this book, I mean, the protagonist is meant to be unlikable, and she is. And you're just kind of rooting the whole time for her downfall. It was just a very entertaining read and kind of an extended call-out post to the entire publishing industry. Now, if you know me at all, or have talked to me at all about books, then you will have been expecting this author to appear on this video at least once. And it is Natalie Haynes, and this is Divine Light. So this is Natalie Haynes' second non-fiction book, and this one is about the portrayal of goddesses in Greek myth all the way through to kind of modern contemporary media. And not only did I find this super insightful, but it was also really entertaining. Like, this is the one book this year that made me laugh out loud, really unexpectedly. Like, honestly, I feel like other academic writers need to, like, take a leaf out of Natalie Haynes' book, literally, and write in a similar style to her. And that way, reading academic stuff for research would be a lot more entertaining. My only criticism of this book was that it did not come out soon enough for me to use it in my master's dissertation, because it would have revolutionised the game for me. So that's the one thing that I am a little bit angry about. But other than that, this was fantastic. And next up, and this is this author's second appearance in this video, it's Winter by Ali Smith, which I read pretty recently. It's one of the newest additions to my favourite books. And this is part of the seasonal quartet that Ali Smith has written. They're all kind of 4 books named after the different seasons, and then she's just released a companion piece to the quartet, a 5th book to add on to the series. And this is the first book in the series that I have read, although it's not the first book in the series in terms of release order. And this book is basically about a family that isn't particularly close to each other. It's a mother who is in her 70s, her estranged sister, and her son, who is an adult. And they all kind of converge on the mother's house for the Christmas holidays. And things kind of go from there. There's a lot of kind of tension between the characters because they don't necessarily agree on certain subjects, and they're all kind of dealing with their own issues in life, and they're kind of quite specific issues. For example, the son, his ex-girlfriend is currently impersonating him on Twitter with his nature blog and posting some really strange misinformation and trying to discredit him, which is a very weird and specific issue that someone has. But I really enjoy characters with specific issues because it makes them all the more real, I guess. But what I love most about this book is its prose. Much like Ali Smith's other entrant onto this list, Girl Meets Boy, the prose is so beautiful and so evocative, and it's full of this kind of melancholy, kind of bleak feeling that is so appropriate for winter. Winter is a kind of a quiet season where things are either dead or hibernating, and yeah, there's kind of a real feeling of that in the writing of this book. It also has one of the best opening chapters that I have ever read, and I want to read you a little bit of it because I think it's so great. God was dead to begin with, and romance was dead, chivalry was dead, poetry, the novel, painting, they were all dead, and art was dead. Theatre and cinema were both dead. Literature was dead. The book was dead. Modernism, postmodernism, realism, and surrealism were all dead. Jazz was dead. Pop music, disco, rap, classical music, dead. Culture was dead. Decency, society, family values were dead. The past was dead. History was dead. The welfare state was dead. Politics was dead. Democracy was dead. Communism, fascism, neoliberalism, capitalism, all dead. And Marxism, dead. Feminism, also dead. Political correctness, dead. Racism was dead. Religion was dead. Thought was dead. Hope was dead. Truth and fiction were both dead. The media was dead. The internet was dead. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Google, dead. Love was dead. Death was dead. a great many things were dead. Isn't that such a great opening? So if you like the sound of that, then I would definitely give Winter a try, and I guess the whole of the seasonal quartet. I'm gonna read the books kind of as each season passes. I think that would be quite a fun way to read them, I guess, because reading about winter in winter was really evocative, I felt. So yeah, I look forward to reading the rest of the series in 2024. And finally, rounding out this section of 4.5 star books, we have Homefire by Camilla Shamsu. This is a modern day retelling of the myth of Antigone in the Theban cycle, and it's set in the UK between two families of Pakistani Muslims. And one family is quite well connected. The father, the patriarch of the family, is an MP, and he kind of got to where he is today in terms of politics and his social standing by kind of distancing himself from other Pakistani Muslims and kind of speaking against them. And on the other hand, with the other family, their father was convicted as a terrorist, a member of ISIS, and ended up dying in Guantanamo Bay. And the brother of this family, the son, he ended up following his father to this jihadist camp. And his sisters, the two daughters in the family, kind of have to deal with the fallout of that. And then these two families kind of clash, and it all kind of spirals from there. And it doesn't sound particularly like a retelling of a Greek myth, but there are so many kind of allusions and similarities to the story. It really shows what you can do with a mythological retelling and how you can kind of reframe these classic stories that are millennia old, and they are still very much relevant today. I thought it was really clever and really poignant, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. Hello, it's the next day, it's January 1st, 2024, woo! And I'm just going to get stuck right in and tell you about my 4.75 star reads of 2023. Now, these are the books that I had a really, really enjoyable time reading. They were pretty much perfect reads, but they didn't hit quite as hard as my 5-star reads. And honestly, the kind of gaps between 4.5 stars and 4.75 stars and 4.75 and 5-star books are kind of a little bit vague and blurred and based almost entirely on vibes. Essentially, every single book that I am talking about in this video is really, really good, and I would recommend them to anyone. So yeah, all of these kind of ratings are completely arbitrary and very subjective to myself. So the first book in this part of the list is, well, actually it's a series, it's the Hunger Games series by Suzanne Collins. Now you might be wondering, Liv, why are these books on your list? Surely they must be rereads this year. And my answer to that is, actually, this was my first time ever reading the Hunger Games series. I was a massive Divergent girly growing up in kind of my tweens, early teens, and I didn't really see the appeal in reading a series about a bunch of kids violently killing each other. So I decided to kind of stick with Divergent as my main dystopian fiction fix. And yeah, honestly, I'm quite glad that I did put off reading The Hunger Games until now, because I don't think that 14-year-old me would have appreciated these books as much as I do now. I think that the world building is so intricate and really vivid, and the politics of Panem and the capital and the resistance against the capital, all of that kind of political intrigue stuff is really interesting to me, and the characters are all very kind of complex, and they're all quite in-depth considering that there are so many characters and a lot of them don't get a lot of time spent on them before, you know, they're killed off. And then Katniss is just a fantastic protagonist, in my opinion. She is one of the best heroines in contemporary literature, if not literature full stop. The thing about Katniss is that she is such an important figure in the revolution, but she never wanted any of that. She's kind of this unwilling heroine, and that makes her all the more compelling. She doesn't want like fame or glory or money. All she's kind of driven by is trying to protect the people that she loves, like Prim and her mother and Gale and Peter, and that's how she kind of stumbles into being the Mockingjay. And throughout all of this, she kind of stays very grounded. So that is the Hunger Games series. I do think that the first book, this one, is my favourite out of the four, I guess, followed quite closely by The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I did really enjoy that book, although I feel like it could have been a little bit shorter. Next up we have Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, and I have talked about this book before. I talked about it in my kind of mid-year roundup video, so I'm not going to spend a massive amount of time on it. It's basically this kind of space adventure where this guy, his name's Ryland Grace, he wakes up and he has no memory of who he is, what he's meant to be doing, and it takes him a while to realise that he is this kind of lone passenger on a spaceship. He is the sole survivor of this mission into space to save the world, and he spends a lot of this book trying to figure out what he actually has to do. And I just thought that the narration in this book is just really engaging and really funny. It's kind of witty and sarcastic and very casual, as if, you know, Ryland Grace is just discussing his thought process with a friend. And that's what really kind of grounds the book, especially when it's talking about these really kind of complex mathematical and scientific concepts. It stops the book from sounding incredibly condescending and boring. And I could go on and on about this book, but I'm not going to. So that is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. Next up we have one of the last books that I read this year. One of the last bookish things I did was reread the entire Heartstopper series, because I got Heartstopper Volume 5 for Christmas and I wanted to refresh my my memory of the series. And then I read this one for the first time, and yeah, I wasn't sure if anything was going to top Volume 3 with the Paris trip and everything, but this one is my favourite in the series so far. So basically Nick is in his penultimate year of school, he's applying to university and he's kind of worried about moving far away from Charlie, who is just kind of gradually healing from his trauma and his mental health issues. And while the graphic novel does focus on their relationship, there are a lot of side characters who have been introduced and developed throughout the whole series, and they all kind of get their moment in the spotlight. And this book, this whole series, really has this overarching theme of friendship and asking for help and support from your friends. And it is just such a sweet story, and the characters are just so accurate for teenagers. Like, there's a whole section in this volume about, like, they're talking about like sex ed, and just the way that they talk about that is just so kind of on point as teenagers who don't really have any idea really what they're talking about. It is just so sweet. Like, there is a special place in my heart for this series, and I am both excited and devastated about Volume 6 coming out in the future, because it's going to be the last one in the series, and after that it's going to be no more Nick and Charlie and their friends, and I'm going to miss them. But at least I can reread the graphic novel series and rewatch the Netflix series several times until then. Next up we have The Wolf Den by Elodie Harper, and this also includes its sequel, The House of the Golden Door. I have not yet read The Temple of Fortuna because I'm waiting for it to come out in paperback, but I do have high expectations for that one because the first two books were just so good. I have talked at length about why I love this book so much. You can find all of that on my mid-year roundup video, and also on my mythological retellings reading challenge that I did back in May. There are two kind of main things that I love in particular about this trilogy, and the first thing is the setting. The fact that Elodie Harper can recreate Pompeii and describe it so vividly that it just feels like this alive and bustling city, even though, you know, this is a story set 2,000 years in the past and the city is completely, you know, extinct now. It's ruins. It was covered over by a volcano. Is that spoiling the trilogy? It might be spoiling the trilogy. Oh well, it happened 2,000 years ago, so you can't really say that it's too soon. And the second thing is the characterizations. This book, and also The House of the Golden Door, has some of the most well-written and complex and complicated female characters and relationships that I have read in maybe ever. Like, she doesn't shy away from making the characters extremely driven and, as a result, kind of morally grey and complex. Amara is such a great protagonist, and she has these really complicated friendships with the women at the Wolf Den, and she's so determined to get herself free of that place and into free Pompeian society that she kind of ends up becoming this quite cutthroat figure. And her rivalry, her kind of rapport with the villain of the series, this pimp Felix, who originally owns her, is just really, it's filled with such tension because you don't exactly know who has the upper hand. You always feel like Felix is like 10 or so steps ahead. You really want Amara to succeed, but you're never sure that she will because you just don't know what tricks Felix has up his sleeves. He is just such a sinister and slimy villain. Like, he is a genuinely awful person. It's just so thrilling to read, and I would absolutely recommend this to anyone who is into historical fiction. Even people who aren't into historical fiction, like, this is just, yeah, a great book. And finally, in this section of the video, and this will come at no surprise to anyone, it is Babel by R.F. Kuang. And again, I feel like this is a book that needs no explanation. I did talk about it in my mid-year roundup, so I'm not going to spend a massive amount of time on it. It's this kind of dark academia, magical realism kind of book that comments a lot on colonialism and imperialism and how all of that stuff has kind of infected the Western academic circles. I absolutely adored a lot of stuff that was in this book. Like, I thought that the magic system was so well integrated into the world that I kind of forgot that I was reading a fantasy book. A lot of the time, like, I'm not that big into fantasy, but I found myself quite surprised by how much I enjoyed the book and the magic system in particular. I also thought that the discussions about like translation and use of language was really interesting, but of course I am a classicist and I studied languages for a significant portion of my life, so of course I would be interested in that kind of stuff. I think I did say when I finished this book earlier in the year, because I believe I read it like kind of February, March time, like quite early on in the year. I think I remember saying that I don't know if I can see myself rereading this book because it is just so long, and it took me such a long time to read at the time. But I feel like I kind of changed my mind about that. Like, I could see myself rereading this in the future, and I did end up getting myself a paperback copy so that if the time to reread this does come, I don't have to haul this around with me, because I ended up taking this massive hardback copy with me to Durham on the train, and it was just a lot of unnecessary weight. Yeah, I think a paperback would be a better idea and a little bit more portable, as pretty as this book is. So that is Babel by R.F. Kuang. Now, the time has come. We have arrived at our final 4 books in this video. These are the creme de la creme, the best of the best. These are the books that live in my head rent-free. These books genuinely altered my brain chemistry when I read them, and these are my 5-star reads of 2023. First up, and again, this will come as no surprise to anyone who knows me, it's our queen, Natalie Haynes, back at it again with 1,000 Ships. This is her retelling of the Trojan War, and it's retold from the perspectives of all of the women who were involved in it. And when I say all of the women, I mean all of the women. Like, from the most well-known, like Penelope and Cassandra and Briseis, all the way to like the most obscure names of like wives of soldiers who, you know, died very early on in the war. And throughout all of this, you have this kind of occasional commentary from Calliope, who is one of the muses, and she is kind of wresting control of the story from this male bard who is retelling the story of the Trojan War, and she is deliberately centering this story on the women involved and making them the heroines of the war rather than the male heroes of the war, who are generally more well known. And I just thought that it was a really interesting take on the story, and I have a soft spot for retellings of the Trojan War, but I think this one is possibly my favourite, if not definitely one of my all-time favourites. I would definitely say though, if you are just kind of getting into reading about Greek mythology and Greek mythological retellings, I wouldn't start with this, because I think it's best if you have a certain level of knowledge about the Trojan War and characters within the Trojan War before you dive into this. Otherwise it may potentially get a little bit confusing in terms of chronology and who's who, because you don't always get like an explanation of this is the wife of so-and-so and she's going to be narrating the next chapter. It just kind of puts you in the middle of their story and you kind of have to figure out the context from there. So I would definitely read around this book before getting into this book, but it's definitely worth it. Next up is actually the only new addition to this list. The other 3 books in this section of 5-star reads I did actually talk about in my mid-year roundup, but this one I read in the second half of the year, so I haven't had a chance to talk about it. And ironically, I'm currently working on a this video will not end until I get a 5-star read video, and my first attempt at making that video, I read this book, and it was the first book I read for that video, so I decided to give up because otherwise it would have been an incredibly short video, and the one I'm working on at the moment has turned into an incredibly long video, so I am having regrets, but I am not regretting reading this book. And this is The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. This is this kind of space opera, I guess, about a crew of a spaceship that goes on a long-haul flight to the very furthest edge of the civilized galaxy, and they have to go there and then build a wormhole and tunnel back to the middle of this galaxy. And so they're all kind of stuck in close proximity for a super long time, and you kind of follow this very eclectic cast of different species of aliens, and they kind of have to work together, and they sometimes kind of clash in opinions, and a lot of things kind of happen on this journey and they have to work together to get through those things. Now, one of my favourite tropes of all time is the found family trope, and I particularly love found family in the sense of like a group of people being stuck in close proximity and they're kind of forced to become each other's family because they have no one else in kind of close proximity to each other. As I said, the found family dynamic in this book is incredible. I loved it so much, and the kind of bickering between the characters and the times when they have to work together and put aside their differences, I just thought it was so heartwarming to read. And there are definitely some sad and heartbreaking moments, but there are also some really wholesome moments, and I think it strikes a good balance between the two. So that is why I gave it 5 stars. And I actually bought the next book in the series today to read. So I think I'll be reading that fairly soon, and I do have high hopes. Next up we have This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Matar and Max Gladstone. This is another book that I think requires very little explanation, mostly because I always have no idea how to explain this book. It's essentially about 2 characters who are kind of enemies, rivals on opposing sides of this multiversal war that spans across timelines and universes. And they go about kind of thwarting each other's plans to kind of give their own side an advantage in this war. And they leave each other notes. And throughout those notes, those letters, they start to fall in love. And what I loved about this book is the writing. It's just so beautifully written and full of some really romantic and yearning and tender lines. And it really kind of sucks you in. And it doesn't matter that you don't necessarily understand what's going on. It's more about the vibes that are truly immaculate. Vibes are immaculate. So that is This Is How You Lose the Time War. I would genuinely recommend reading this. Like, it is so short and so impactful, and it will not take you very long. So yeah, please read it. And finally, we've come to the last book in this video, and I am still so mad that I don't have a physical copy of it because I read it as an ebook the first time, and I need a physical copy because I want to hold it in my hands. And this, again, will come as no surprise to anyone who has seen my mid-year roundup video, firstly, but anyone who knows me. And this is Bunny by Mona Awad. This is kind of a dark academia book with supernatural elements about a girl at an arts college who falls in with a clique of young women in her creative writing class who call each other Bunny, and they have poetry readings and kind of form a cult that creates men out of rabbits. It's so bizarre and really random, but the writing is so good. It's got kind of this prose that is so full of description, and there are, dream sequences, and there's a section that is just kind of, it's told in like 4th person perspective, like it uses we pronouns rather than I, and I thought that was really cool to read, especially in the part of the story that it happens in. And it's just this weird book, and it like genuinely altered my brain chemistry. Like, I have not stopped thinking about it, and I read this book back in like January. It was ages ago. I did talk about Bunny more in my mid-year roundup, I think. But yeah, it's just one of those books that's so difficult to explain. But again, the vibes are immaculate. A lot of these books, a lot of my judgments come off of just vibes. I guess that's just the person I am. It's incredibly subjective and not very easy to explain, but that's just the way my brain works. And that's it. Those are the 23 books that were my favourites to read in 2023. And if you haven't read them already, then I think they should be a part of your 2024 reading list. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way through to the end. I really appreciate it. If you liked what you saw, then give it a like. Please subscribe to my channel. I am intending to put out a lot more stuff in the coming year, post maybe a little bit more regularly. I have more ideas for kind of reading challenges or just general videos of like book recommendations. And of course, if you want to see anything or any kind of videos from me, then please leave suggestions in the comments. If you have read any of these books that I talked about in this video and you also enjoyed them, please also gush about them in the comments, because I just love talking about my favourite books and I love listening to other people talk about their favourite books. So if there are any other books that you particularly enjoyed in the past year, then also leave them down in the comments, because I'm always looking for book recommendations. You can follow me on Instagram or TikTok or the Storygraph. My username is WithLivJones on all of those platforms. I post fairly regularly, especially on the Storygraph. I update that every day. I have a good streak of like 300 days now, and I review every single book that I read as soon as I've read it. So that is the first place to go to get updates on what I have been reading and enjoying, or not so much enjoying. It means that you don't have to wait an entire 6 months for me to make a wrap-up video of my favourite books. Thank you so much again for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!